Blood soaked through the bandage faster than Mira Voss could replace it. The man on the table was thrashing, his breath coming in ragged pulls, and somewhere behind her, a guard was shouting for her to step back, before he tore her apart with his bare hands. She did not step back. She pressed both palms against the wound, and pushed her healing energy into him, the way her mentor had taught her, feeling the hot rush of power leave her fingers and sink into torn muscle. Nobody had told her his name. Nobody had told her anything at all. She had walked into the Blackthorn Citadel that morning with a single bag over her shoulder and a certificate rolled up inside it. Proof that she had passed her healer's trial, with the highest marks her class had ever seen. A tired clerk at the front gate had glanced at her papers, stamped them, and pointed her toward the East Wing without another word. That was the whole of her welcome. The East Wing was a maze of stone corridors, lit by lanterns that flickered against damp walls. Healers rushed past her carrying trays of herbs and rolls of clean linen, none of them pausing long enough to explain where she was supposed to go. She had asked 3 different people which patient she had been assigned to, and each of them had simply pointed further down the hall, as if the question were beneath answering. Finally, an older woman, with silver hair and tired eyes, shoved a folded chart into her hands and told her, in a rushed and clipped voice, that the private recovery room at the very end of the corridor needed attention immediately, and that no other healer had managed to stay inside it for more than a few minutes. Mira should have asked why. She would think about that later, turning it over and over, wondering what would have happened if she had simply asked one more question before pushing open that heavy door. But she had not asked. She had been too eager to prove herself, too used to walking straight toward the worst injuries, because that was where a healer's skill actually mattered. So she walked down the corridor, knocked once out of habit, and let herself into the room without waiting for an answer. The first thing she noticed was the smell of blood, thick and metallic, clinging to the air like a fog. The second thing she noticed was the man himself, stretched across a wide bed with dark sheets soaked through in several places, his chest rising and falling in shallow, furious bursts. He was enormous, even lying down, with shoulders that seemed to fill half the room, and forearms corded with muscle that flexed every time pain ripped through him. His hair was dark and damp with sweat, plastered against his forehead, and his eyes, when they opened and found her, burned with a kind of anger she had never seen directed at her before. "Get out," he said, his voice low and rough, more growl than words. Mira set her bag down on the small table beside the bed instead. "I'm not here to hurt you," she said, keeping her voice even, the way she had practiced 100 times on patients who were frightened or in pain. "I'm here to stop the bleeding. That's all." He tried to sit up, and the movement tore something loose inside him, because he let out a sound that was half curse and half agony, collapsing back against the pillows with his jaw clenched so tightly she could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. Blood spread wider across the sheet beneath him. Whatever pride was keeping him from calling for help, it was going to kill him faster than his wounds would. She moved closer, ignoring the warning growl that rumbled from somewhere deep in his chest, and pulled back the edge of the blanket to see what she was actually dealing with. The wound along his side was deep and jagged, clearly made by a blade, and it had reopened from whatever struggle he'd just had with his own stubbornness. There were other injuries too, older bruises darkening along his ribs, a shallow cut across his forearm that had been stitched poorly by someone in a hurry. "I said get out," he repeated, though the words came out weaker this time, less like a command, and more like a man running out of strength to fight with. "If you want me gone, you'll have to actually make me leave," she said, pressing a clean cloth against the wound with steady pressure. "Because I'm not walking away from a patient who's bleeding out in front of me. That's not how this works." Something in his expression shifted, just slightly, like her answer had caught him off guard. Most people who worked in this citadel flinched when he raised his voice. Most people did not stand this close to him while he was in this state, half out of his mind with pain and something else, something that made the air around him feel charged, like the moments before a storm broke. But this woman, whoever she was, simply kept working, her hands quick and sure, her breathing calm despite how close she stood. He watched her through half-lidded eyes as she worked, noting the sharp focus on her face, completely unlike the fear he was used to seeing. She did not know who he was. That much was obvious. If she had known, she would have run the moment she saw his face, or worse, she would have hovered nervously at the edge of the room, and called for someone senior to handle the actual treatment, while she stood back and watched, the way every healer before her had done. "I need you to hold still," she said, reaching for a jar of salve inside her bag. "This is going to feel warm, and it might sting for a moment, but it will help close the wound faster than stitches alone." "I don't need your remedies," he muttered, though he did not pull away when her hands returned to his side. "You clearly do, considering half the room is stained red," she said, and there was no fear in her tone at all, only a kind of dry practicality that almost made him want to laugh, if laughing wouldn't have cost him what little breath he had left. She worked in silence after that, applying the salve, checking the depth of the wound with careful fingers, murmuring instructions to herself under her breath, the way healers often did when they were concentrating. He found himself watching her hands instead of the ceiling, following the movement of her fingers as they worked, feeling the sharp sting of the salve fade into something closer to relief. The pain in his side, which had been a constant roaring pressure for hours, began to dull at the edges. "Who sent you?" he asked finally, his voice steadier now. "Someone in the hallway. An older healer with silver hair. She didn't give me a name," she said. "She just told me this room needed attention, and that no one else had managed to stay inside long enough to help." "That's because I told them to leave," he said. "And yet here I am," she said, glancing up at him with something that might have been the ghost of a smile. "Are you going to tell me to leave again, or can I finish stopping the bleeding first?" He studied her for a long moment, the anger that had been simmering under his skin for hours, slowly draining away, replaced by something far more unfamiliar. It had been weeks since anyone had touched him without flinching, weeks since anyone had spoken to him without either terror or careful, practiced formality, weighing down every word. This woman spoke to him like he was simply a patient, a man with a wound that needed closing, nothing more and nothing less. "Finish then," he said quietly. She nodded once and returned to her work, threading a fine needle with practiced ease, closing the reopened section of the wound with small, precise stitches. He watched her the entire time, and somewhere in the back of his mind, buried under exhaustion and pain, he registered the strange fact that her scent was different from anyone else who had entered this room in weeks. It was clean and steady, without the sharp edge of fear that usually rolled off healers the moment they crossed his threshold. He did not understand why that detail mattered so much to him in that moment, but it did, and it settled something restless in his chest that had been clawing at him since the attack that put him in this bed in the first place. By the time she finished, the bleeding had slowed to almost nothing, and color was beginning to return to his face. She checked his pulse at his wrist, counted quietly under her breath, and made a small, satisfied sound when she found it steady. "You should rest now," she said, gathering her supplies back into her bag. "I'll need to check on you again in a few hours, to make sure the stitches hold." He caught her wrist before she could step away, his grip firm but not painful, more like he needed to confirm she was actually real, and not some fevered vision his exhausted mind had conjured up. "What's your name?" he asked. "Mira," she said. "Mira Voss." He released her wrist slowly, watching her expression for any sign that his touch had frightened her, but there was none. Just calm, steady patience, the same expression she'd worn since walking through the door. "Rest," she said again, softer this time, and then she turned and left the room, leaving him alone with the strange, unfamiliar quiet that settled in her absence, a quiet that felt very different from the silence he'd grown used to over the past several weeks. Outside in the corridor, Mira allowed herself a long breath, only now realizing how tense her shoulders had been the entire time she was in that room. She had treated difficult patients before, plenty of them, people in pain who lashed out at anyone who came near, but there had been something different about the man in that bed, some quality in the way the room itself seemed to hum with pent-up tension. She told herself it did not matter. A patient was a patient, and she had done her job well. That was all that mattered. She made her way back down the corridor, intending to find the older healer who had directed her there and ask for her next assignment, but she had not gone more than a few steps before she noticed something odd. The healers and staff members she passed were staring at her, their conversations dying mid-sentence as she walked by, their eyes following her with a mixture of shock and something close to fear. A young healer carrying a stack of folded sheets nearly dropped them entirely when she caught sight of Mira's face. "You went into the private recovery room," the young healer said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Alone. I was told to, Mira said, confused by the reaction. Is something wrong? Before the young healer could answer, a firm hand landed on Mira's shoulder, turning her around. The silver-haired healer, who had given her the assignment earlier, stood there now, her face pale, her eyes wide, with something that looked very much like panic. You went inside, the older woman said, and it was not a question. You told me to, Mira said slowly. You said the patient needed help, and that no one else could stay in the room long enough. The older woman's mouth opened and closed several times before any words came out. Do you have any idea who that patient is? She finally asked. Mira shook her head. No one told me his name. I didn't ask. I was just doing my job. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Mira began to feel a cold unease settling into her stomach, the kind of feeling that told her something had gone very wrong, even though she could not yet understand what. That is King Kale Draven, the older woman said at last, her voice dropping even lower, as though simply saying the words too loudly might summon some kind of disaster. The Alpha King. And you are the first unbonded Omega healer to walk into his room alone since the attack that nearly killed him. The words hit Mira like a physical blow, and for a moment she could only stand there in the corridor, staring at the older woman, trying to make sense of what she had just heard. She had touched him. She had stitched his wounds with her bare hands, stood close enough to feel the heat radiating from his skin, spoken to him without a single guard standing between them. If what this woman was saying was true, if he really was the king, then everything about that encounter suddenly felt far more significant than she had understood in the moment. I didn't know, Mira said, her voice smaller now than she intended. No one told me. I was just following the assignment I was given. The older woman studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her tired eyes, and then she let out a slow breath and shook her head. It's done now, she said. What's done is done. But you had better prepare yourself, because there are going to be questions. A great many questions. And not everyone in this citadel is going to believe that you truly had no idea who you were treating. Mira's mind raced back over every second of the encounter, searching for anything she might have said or done that could be misunderstood, any detail that might be twisted into something it was not. She had done nothing wrong. She had simply done her job, the job she had trained years for, the job she had been so proud to finally begin. And yet standing in that corridor, watching the fear and suspicion in the older healer's eyes, she understood with sudden and complete clarity that her first day in the Blackthorn Citadel had already become something far larger and far more dangerous than she could have imagined. Word moved through the Citadel faster than she could keep up with it. By the time she reached the small quarters assigned to new healers, a narrow room with a single bed and a wash basin, whispers were already following her down every hallway. She caught fragments as she passed, voices dropping to murmurs the moment they noticed her nearby. Someone said the king had refused every healer sent to him for nearly 2 weeks, driving away 3 separate physicians with nothing but the force of his temper, and the danger that came with an alpha in pain. Someone else said that no unbonded Omega had been permitted anywhere near the royal wing since long before the attack, a rule so old and so deeply understood that no one had ever thought to write it down for a newcomer like her. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed once she reached her quarters, replaying the encounter over and over in her mind. She thought about the way his growl had softened the longer she stayed, the way his shoulders had eased when she pressed the salve against his wound, the strange quiet that had settled over the room by the time she finished her work. It had simply felt like healing, like doing the work she had trained her entire life to do. But now, sitting alone in the dim light of her new quarters, she could not shake the feeling that something had shifted the moment she walked through that door, something far bigger than a single treatment, something that was only just beginning to unfold. A knock came at her door before she had time to settle her thoughts. When she opened it, she found a royal guard standing in the corridor, his expression carefully blank, his hand resting near the hilt of the blade at his side. "The Healers' Council requests your presence immediately," he said. "There are questions that need answering." Mira's stomach tightened, but she nodded and followed him out into the corridor, her mind still turning over every moment of that strange, tense hour she had spent stitching the wounds of a king she had not known she was healing. Whatever came next, she understood now that there was no undoing what had already happened. She had walked into that room a stranger, and she had walked out of it, tangled in something she did not yet fully understand, something that felt, even now, like it was only the very beginning. The council chamber was colder than the rest of the citadel, its stone walls unadorned except for banners bearing the royal crest, a wolf howling beneath a crown of thorns. 7 healers sat behind a long table, their faces ranging from curious to openly hostile, and Mira felt every one of their eyes settle on her the moment she stepped through the doors. The guard who had escorted her took his place near the entrance, and she was left standing alone in the center of the chamber, her hands folded in front of her to keep them from trembling. "State your name and your assignment," said the woman at the center of the table, an older healer with a stern face and silver rings on every finger. "Mira Voss," she said, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage. "I arrived at the Citadel this morning. I was given a chart and directed to the private recovery room at the end of the east corridor. I was not told the identity of the patient before I entered." A murmur rippled through the council, and the woman at the center raised a hand for silence. "You are aware," she said slowly, "that it is forbidden for an unbonded Omega healer to treat the king without a chaperone present. This rule has existed for generations, meant to protect both the king and the healer during a period when his instincts run closest to the surface." "I was not aware," Mira said honestly. "No one explained the rule to me. I was simply told the patient needed urgent care, and when I arrived, he was bleeding badly enough that any delay could have cost him his life. I made the decision a healer is trained to make. I treated the wound in front of me." Another council member, a thin man with sharp eyes, leaned forward. "And in the time you spent alone with him, did he touch you? Did he show any signs of losing control?" Mira thought of the moment his hand had closed around her wrist, firm but careful, and the strange quiet that followed. "He held my wrist for a moment," she said. "He asked my name. That was all. He did not harm me in any way." The council exchanged glances, some skeptical, some thoughtful, and for a long moment, no one spoke. Finally, the woman at the center folded her hands and studied Mira with an expression that was difficult to read. "You understand the seriousness of what has happened today," she said. "The king has refused treatment from every healer sent to him since the attack. He has not allowed anyone to remain in that room for more than a few minutes at a time. And yet you walked in as a complete stranger, with no knowledge of who he was, and you managed to close his wounds and calm him enough to rest. That is either remarkable skill or something else entirely." "I only did my job," Mira said again, because it was the truest thing she could offer them, the only answer she had. The council dismissed her shortly after, instructing her to remain within the Citadel grounds while they deliberated further, and as she walked back through the cold stone corridors toward her quarters, she could feel the weight of dozens of curious and wary eyes following her the entire way. She had no idea, not yet, that behind the heavy doors of the council chamber, an argument was already breaking out about what to do with her. An argument that would decide far more than just her future assignment. An argument that would soon be interrupted entirely by a single, unshakable demand from the king himself. Because deep in the private recovery room at the end of the east corridor, Cale Draven lay awake long after Mira had gone, staring at the ceiling, his wounds finally beginning to ease, his mind circling back again and again to the steady, fearless presence of the healer who had refused to run from him. And when the physician on duty finally worked up the courage to check on him that evening, the king's first words were not about his pain or his recovery. "Bring back the healer who treated me this morning," he said. "Mira Voss. I want no one else near me but her." The physician's face went pale, because he understood immediately what those words meant, and how deeply they would shake the fragile order the Citadel had spent generations building around the king's protection. He bowed quickly and hurried from the room to deliver the message, already dreading the chaos it was certain to unleash. And far away in her small quarters, unaware that her fate had just been decided by a king who barely knew her name, Mira Voss sat by her window, watching the last light of day fade over the Citadel walls, wondering what tomorrow would bring, and having no idea just how much her simple act of healing had already changed the course of everything around her. The message reached the council chamber before Mira had even finished unpacking the small bag of belongings she had carried with her that morning. A young attendant burst through the heavy doors mid-argument, breathless, announcing that the king himself had spoken, that he had refused every physician sent to check on him, and demanded, in no uncertain terms, that the new healer named Mira Voss be the only one permitted to treat him going forward. The chamber fell into stunned silence, and then erupted into an argument louder than the one before it. Word of the king's demand spread through the citadel within the hour, moving faster than any healer could walk from one wing to another. By the time a guard arrived at Mira's quarters to summon her back, she had already heard 3 different versions of the story from passing servants, each one stranger than the last. One version claimed the king had threatened to dismiss the entire healing staff if his order was not obeyed. Another claimed he had not spoken at all, only pointed toward the door and growled her name once, as though that alone were explanation enough. Mira followed the guard back through the winding corridors, her thoughts spinning too fast to settle on any single worry. She had expected to be questioned again, perhaps even reprimanded for entering the king's chamber without proper clearance. But she had not expected this. She had not expected to be summoned, because the king himself wanted her back. The council chamber was even colder than before, the air thick with tension that pressed against her skin the moment she stepped inside. This time, there were more than 7 people seated at the long table. Senior guards stood along the walls, their arms crossed, their expressions unreadable. At the head of the room stood a man she had not seen before, tall and composed, wearing robes marked with the royal crest, his face lined with the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent years managing crises far larger than himself. "This is Commander Alden Voss," the silver-haired councilwoman said, gesturing toward him. "No relation to you, in case you were wondering. He oversees the Royal Guard and has served the crown for nearly 20 years. He will explain the situation." "The king has requested that you continue as his primary healer," Alden said without preamble, his voice calm but firm, the voice of a man used to delivering difficult news. "This request has caused significant concern among the council, given the long-standing protocols meant to protect unbonded Omegas from prolonged exposure to an Alpha during vulnerable recovery. However, the king's word carries weight that cannot simply be dismissed, particularly given his current physical state, and the danger of allowing that state to worsen through further refusal of care." Mira stood very still, processing what she was hearing. "Are you saying I have a choice in this?" she asked carefully. "You do," Alden said. "No healer can be forced into this role against their will. But I want you to understand fully what you are agreeing to before you answer. The king has not allowed anyone this close since the attack that injured him. His instincts in this state are unpredictable. There is a reason the old rules exist. They were not written carelessly." Around the table, several council members shifted uncomfortably, and Mira could feel the weight of their doubt pressing against her from every direction. She thought of the man in that bed, the way his growl had faded into something almost gentle by the time she finished stitching his wound, the calm that had settled between them despite everything that should have made the room feel dangerous. She did not fully understand what had happened in that hour, but she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she had not been afraid. "I'll do it," she said. The silence that followed was thick enough to feel. Several council members exchanged glances, and the silver-haired woman at the center of the table let out a slow breath, as though she had been hoping for a different answer and had not truly expected one. "You understand there will be conditions," Alden said. "A guard will remain stationed outside the door at all times. You will report any change in his condition, physical or otherwise, directly to me or to the senior healer on duty, and you will be observed closely, both for your own protection and for the stability of the citadel. This arrangement is unusual, and unusual arrangements draw scrutiny." "I understand," Mira said, and she meant it, even though a small part of her wondered exactly how much scrutiny she was about to find herself under. The council dismissed her shortly after, though not without a final warning from the silver-haired woman, who caught her by the arm just before she reached the door. "Be careful," the woman said quietly, her voice losing some of its earlier sharpness. "Whatever is happening between you and the king, it did not go unnoticed today. There are people in this citadel who will see your closeness to him as an opportunity, and others who will see it as a threat. Trust very few, and watch everything." Mira nodded, though the warning settled uneasily in her chest as she made her way back toward the east wing, the guard from earlier once again walking a pace behind her. She thought about the strange formality of the council, the layers of protocol wrapped around a simple act of healing, and wondered if she had truly understood what she was agreeing to when she said yes. When she reached the door to the private recovery room, the guard posted there straightened at her approach, giving her a short nod before stepping aside to let her pass. Inside, the room looked different in the fading afternoon light than it had that morning. The shadows longer, the air calmer. Cale was sitting up now, propped against a stack of pillows, his color much improved from the pale, blood-drained figure she had left behind hours earlier. He watched her enter, with an intensity that made her pause just inside the doorway. "You came back," he said, and there was something almost uncertain in his voice, a crack in the composure she had expected from a king. "You asked for me," she said, setting her bag down on the same small table as before. "Apparently that carries a lot of weight around here." A ghost of a smile crossed his face, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "I'm told my request caused quite a stir among the council." "That might be putting it mildly," she said, moving closer to check the bandages along his side. "How are you feeling?" "Better," he admitted, watching her hands as she worked. "The pain has eased since this morning. I slept for the first time in days." "That's a good sign," she said, carefully unwinding the old bandage to check the stitches beneath. The wound looked clean, the swelling around it already beginning to fade, and she nodded to herself in quiet satisfaction, before applying a fresh layer of salve and wrapping it again with clean linen. "You work quickly," he said. "I've had a lot of practice," she said. "Where I trained, there wasn't much time to be slow about anything." "Where did you train?" he asked, and there was genuine curiosity in his voice now, not the guarded suspicion she might have expected from someone in his position. "A small healing house in the eastern provinces," she said. "Nothing grand. We treated whoever came through the door, mostly farmers and laborers, sometimes soldiers passing through on their way to somewhere else. My mentor used to say that healing doesn't care about titles. A wound is a wound, whether it belongs to a king or a farmhand." "Your mentor sounds like a wise woman," he said. "She was," Mira said, and something in her tone made him look at her more closely, noticing the small shift in her expression, the flicker of something she did not elaborate on. He did not push. He had learned enough today about the value of patience, about how much more people revealed when given room to speak in their own time, rather than pressed for answers before they were ready. They fell into an easier silence after that, one that did not feel strained the way silences often did between strangers. She finished checking his other injuries, the shallow cut on his forearm healing well beneath its stitches, the bruising along his ribs slowly fading from deep purple to a duller shade of green. He watched her work the entire time, and though he tried to attribute the calm settling over him to simple physical relief, he knew, somewhere beneath the surface, that it was something more than that. "You should know the council isn't pleased with this arrangement," she said eventually, sitting back once she finished her examination. "The council is rarely pleased with anything I do," he said, a dry note of humor in his voice that surprised her. "They've spent years trying to manage every part of my life, as though I were a problem to be solved, rather than a person to be listened to. This is not the first time I've made a decision they disagreed with, and I doubt it will be the last. Even so," she said, "they made it clear there will be conditions. A guard outside the door. Regular reports on your condition. I don't think either of us gets to simply forget the rest of the Citadel exists, just because you asked for me specifically. I never expected that we would," he said, and something in the way he said it made her look up at him, searching his expression for whatever lay beneath the words. He held her gaze steadily, none of the earlier anger left in his eyes, only a quiet, careful attention that felt entirely different from anything she had encountered from him that morning. "Why me?" she asked, before she could stop herself. "You don't know anything about me. I could have been anyone." He considered the question for a long moment before answering, as though genuinely searching for the truest response, rather than simply reaching for the easiest one. "Because you didn't flinch," he said finally. "Everyone who has walked into this room since the attack has been afraid of me, whether they admitted it or not. I could smell it on them the moment they crossed the threshold, and it made everything worse, because fear feeds into whatever this instinct is that's been clawing at me since I was injured. You were the first person who simply saw a wound that needed closing. Nothing more, nothing less. It made it easier to let you close." Mira did not have a ready answer for that, so she said nothing, letting the quiet stretch between them instead, filled with something that felt fragile and important, though she could not yet name exactly what it was. Outside the door, she could hear the low murmur of the guard shifting his weight, a reminder that they were not entirely alone, that every word spoken in this room would eventually make its way back to the council, in one form or another. I should let you rest, she said finally, gathering her things. I'll check on you again in the morning. He nodded, though something in his expression suggested he would have preferred she stay longer, a thought that surprised him as much as it might have surprised her had she noticed it. As she reached the door, he spoke again, his voice quieter this time. Thank you, he said, for today, for not running. She paused with her hand on the door, glancing back at him one last time before she left. I don't run from patience, she said simply, and then she was gone, leaving him alone once more with the strange, steady calm she seemed to carry with her wherever she went. A calm that felt, more and more, like something he was not eager to lose. Outside in the corridor, the guard who had been listening at a respectful distance gave her a curious look but said nothing, and Mira walked back toward her quarters with her mind still turning over everything that had passed between them. She thought about the council's warning, the layers of suspicion and scrutiny now surrounding her, and wondered how many more days like this one lay ahead, before whatever was building between her and the king settled into something clearer, something she could understand well enough to know exactly what she had agreed to become a part of. She did not yet know that somewhere else in the citadel, in a chamber far removed from the warmth of the recovery room, a different conversation was taking place, one that would soon reveal just how much danger still lingered around the king, danger that had not ended with his wounds beginning to heal, danger that was only just beginning to notice the new healer standing so close beside him. 3 days passed before Mira understood just how strange her new position within the citadel truly was. She woke each morning to a guard waiting outside her door, escorted her through the same winding corridors to the same private recovery room, and spent hours tending to a king who grew more talkative with each visit, his guarded silence slowly giving way to something closer to conversation. But outside that room, the citadel had become a different place entirely, one filled with sideways glances and hushed conversations that stopped the moment she drew near. She noticed it most clearly in the dining hall reserved for healing staff, where she had hoped to find a few quiet moments to eat, without the weight of curious eyes pressing against her. Instead, the room fell quiet whenever she entered, conversations dying mid-sentence, healers who had barely spoken to her before suddenly finding urgent reasons to leave. Only one person seemed unbothered by the strange new status surrounding her, a young healer named Priya Bennett, who slid into the seat across from Mira on the third morning, with a tray of food and an easy, unguarded smile. You're the talk of the entire citadel, you know, Priya said, tearing a piece of bread in half. Everyone has an opinion about you, and most of them haven't even met you. Mira managed a tired smile in return. That's not exactly comforting. It's not meant to be, Priya said, though her tone was warm, rather than unkind. But for what it's worth, I don't think you did anything wrong. You walked into a room and did your job. It's not your fault nobody bothered to warn you about the rules first. Frankly, half the healers here think it's about time someone treated the king like a person instead of a walking disaster waiting to happen. And the other half, Mira asked. The other half think you're either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish, Priya said with a shrug. Personally, I haven't decided which one it is yet. Maybe both. Mira found herself laughing, despite the tension knotting her shoulders, grateful for the easy company after days of careful formality and watchful silence. Priya, it turned out, had grown up within the citadel walls, the daughter of a healer who had served the previous king, and she seemed to know every rumor circulating through the halls before it had even fully formed. There's talk that the attack on the king wasn't a random act, Priya said, lowering her voice as she leaned across the table. Some of the guards think it was planned from inside the citadel. Someone who knew his schedule, knew when his guard would be thinnest. Mira's stomach tightened at the thought. Do you think that's true? I don't know, Priya admitted. But it would explain why he's been so difficult with every healer sent to him. If you'd nearly been killed by someone you trusted, wouldn't you have trouble letting new people close too? The words stayed with Mira long after she left the dining hall, following her down the corridor toward the private recovery room, settling uneasily into her thoughts as she pushed open the door and found Kale sitting by the window this time, instead of confined to the bed, a blanket draped loosely over his shoulders, his expression distant as he stared out over the citadel grounds. You're up, she said, setting her bag down and moving to check the bandages along his side. The healers before you insisted I stay flat on my back at all times, he said, a wry note in his voice. You never actually gave that instruction. That's because I trust you to know your own limits better than I trust you to follow rules you clearly enjoy breaking, she said, and he let out a short laugh, surprised by her directness in a way that seemed to please him more than offend him. She worked quietly for a few minutes, checking the wound along his side, pleased to find it healing well, the swelling almost entirely gone now, the stitches holding firm. As she worked, she found herself studying his face more closely than she had allowed herself before, noticing the way exhaustion still clung to the corners of his eyes despite the improvement in his physical condition, the way his gaze kept drifting toward the window, as though searching for something just beyond the glass. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally, sitting back once she finished. "You've been asking me things for 3 days now," he said. "I don't see why you'd need permission at this point." She hesitated only a moment before continuing. "What happened? The night you were attacked. No one has told me anything specific, but I've heard whispers that it wasn't a random assault." His expression shifted immediately, the easy warmth from a moment ago giving way to something guarded and distant, and for a moment, she thought he might refuse to answer entirely. But then he let out a slow breath and turned his gaze fully toward her, as though deciding, in that moment, that he trusted her enough to share what he had not shared with anyone else since it happened. "It was late," he said quietly. "I was returning from a meeting with the border commanders, moving through a corridor I've walked 1,000 times before, one I never thought to question the safety of. There were supposed to be 2 guards stationed along that route. There weren't. By the time I realized something was wrong, 3 men were already on me, and whoever sent them knew exactly how to time it, exactly when my usual escort would be thinnest." Mira felt a chill move through her at his words. "Do you know who sent them?" "Not yet," he said, his jaw tightening. "But someone inside these walls made sure that corridor was unguarded that night. Someone who knew my schedule well enough to plan around it. That is not the kind of information easily obtained by outsiders." "You think it's someone close to you," she said. "I think it's someone close enough to the Citadel to move freely without suspicion," he said, "which is precisely why every healer who has come near me since has made me uneasy. Because I don't know who I can trust anymore, and until I do, everyone feels like a threat. Except me," she said quietly. He looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "Except you," he agreed. "Though I couldn't tell you exactly why, if I'm honest." The admission hung in the air between them, heavier than either of them seemed prepared for, and Mira found herself looking away first, unsettled by how much weight those simple words carried. She busied herself with packing away her supplies, needing something to occupy her hands while she processed what he had told her, the knowledge that danger still lingered somewhere within these walls, close enough that it had very nearly cost him his life once already. "I should report this to Commander Alden," she said finally. "If there's a threat still active within the Citadel, he needs to know." "He already knows," Cale said. "He's been investigating quietly since the attack, though we've kept the details limited to only a handful of trusted people. I'm telling you because I think you deserve to understand the danger you've stepped into, given how close you now stand beside me. If whoever orchestrated the attack sees your presence as an obstacle, you may become a target as well." The warning settled into her chest like a stone, but rather than fear, she found herself feeling something closer to resolve. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "Whoever did this, whatever they're planning, running away isn't going to make either of us safer." He studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes that looked almost like admiration, and then he nodded once, a silent acknowledgement that passed between them without need for further words. Outside the window, the sun continued its slow climb across the sky, and somewhere beyond the Citadel walls, unseen and unnamed, the people responsible for the attack that had nearly ended his life were still watching, still waiting, still planning their next move. Later that evening, after Mira had finished her rounds and returned to her quarters, she found Priya waiting outside her door, an unusually serious expression replacing her earlier easy smile. "I heard something you should know," Priya said, glancing down the corridor before continuing in a lowered voice. "One of the senior healers, a man named Garrett Finch, has been asking a lot of questions about you. Where you trained, who recommended you for this posting, whether you had any connections outside the Citadel before you arrived." "That doesn't sound unusual," Mira said carefully. I imagine plenty of people are curious about me right now. This felt different, Priya said. He wasn't just curious. He seemed almost suspicious, like he was trying to find something specific. And he's close with several council members who weren't exactly thrilled about your new arrangement with the king. Mira felt a fresh wave of unease settle over her, joining the earlier warning Kale had given her about the danger still lurking within the citadel walls. Do you think he's connected to what happened to the king? She asked. I don't know, Priya admitted. But it might be worth being careful around him. Whatever he's looking for, I don't think his intentions are friendly. Mira thanked her for the warning and retreated into her quarters once Priya left, sitting on the edge of her narrow bed as she turned the day's events over in her mind. Between Kale's revelation about the attack and Priya's warning about the senior healer's questions, the citadel that had felt merely unfamiliar and overwhelming just days earlier now felt genuinely dangerous, layered with hidden motives and quiet threats she was only beginning to glimpse the edges of. She thought about the council's earlier warning, about trusting few and watching everything, and understood now just how seriously she needed to take those words. Whatever she had stepped into when she walked through that door on her first day, it had grown into something far larger than a simple healing assignment, something tangled up with danger and secrets that reached far beyond the wound she had stitched closed on that very first morning. The days that followed settled into an uneasy rhythm. Each morning, Mira made her way to the private recovery room, where Kale continued his slow but steady recovery, the wound along his side healing cleanly, his strength returning bit by bit. Their conversations grew easier with each visit, filled with small moments of humor that surprised them both, quiet exchanges about their pasts, about the pressures that came with his position, and the years of careful discipline that had shaped her own path toward becoming a healer. But beneath that growing ease, the tension in the citadel continued to build. Garrett Finch's questions about her background grew more persistent, reaching even the healers she had barely spoken to, and twice she noticed him watching her from across the dining hall, with an expression she could not quite read, something between suspicion and calculation that made her skin prickle with unease. On the 5th day, everything shifted again. She arrived at the private recovery room to find Commander Alden already there, speaking in low, urgent tones with Kale, both of their expressions grim, in a way that made her pause just inside the doorway. What's happened? She asked. Alden glanced at her, then at Kale, a silent question passing between them, before Kale gave a small nod, granting permission for her to hear whatever news had brought the commander here in such a state. We found evidence, Alden said finally, turning to face her fully. Evidence that the attack on the king was not the work of outsiders. Someone within these walls provided the information that made it possible. And we believe whoever it was may still be operating close to the king, watching, waiting for another opportunity. Mira's eyes moved to Kale, whose expression had hardened into something cold and focused, all traces of the easy warmth from their earlier conversations gone entirely. Do you know who? She asked. Not yet, Alden said, but we're close, and until we are certain, everyone within this citadel remains a potential suspect, which means everyone close to the king, including you, needs to exercise extreme caution. The weight of his words settled over the room like a physical presence, and Mira found herself thinking again of Garrett Finch's persistent questions, the strange looks she had caught from council members who had never approved of her closeness to the king. Whatever danger still lingered within these walls, it was drawing closer now, tightening around them like a slowly closing fist, and she understood, standing there in that quiet room, that the calm rhythm of the past few days had only ever been the eye of a much larger storm, still gathering strength around them. News of the investigation spread quietly at first, contained within the small circle of people Commander Alden trusted enough to inform, but quiet news within the Blackthorn Citadel rarely stayed quiet for long. By the following morning, Mira could feel the shift in the air the moment she stepped into the corridor. A new tension layered over the suspicion that had already been building around her since her first day. Guards who had once nodded politely now watched her with narrowed, calculating eyes. Healers who had barely acknowledged her presence before now seemed to track her every movement, as though trying to decide whether she belonged among the suspects or the trusted. She found Priya waiting near the entrance to the healing wing, her usual easy smile replaced by a tightness around her eyes that told Mira something new had happened overnight. Garrett Finch was called before Commander Alden this morning, Priya said without preamble, falling into step beside her as they walked. Word is they found something in his quarters. Documents maybe, or letters. Nobody knows exactly what yet, but he hasn't been seen since. Mira's pulse quickened at the news. Do you think he's the one who helped plan the attack? I don't know, Priya said, but it would explain why he was asking so many questions about you. If he was involved, maybe he saw you as a threat to whatever plan he was still working on. The thought settled uneasily in Mira's chest as she continued toward the private recovery room, her mind circling back again and again and to the strange, calculating looks Garrett had given her over the past several days. She had dismissed her unease at the time, telling herself it was simply the natural curiosity anyone might feel toward the newcomer who had unexpectedly become the king's sole healer. Now, knowing what she knew, that unease felt like something closer to instinct, a warning she should have paid closer attention to from the very beginning. When she reached the recovery room, she found Cale already dressed, sitting upright in a chair near the window rather than confined to the bed, a clear sign of how far his recovery had progressed over the past several days. His expression, however, carried none of the lightness that had grown more common between them. Instead, he looked tired, in a way that had nothing to do with his physical wounds, the weight of the ongoing investigation clearly pressing down on him. You've heard, he said as she entered. Everyone has heard, she said, setting her bag down and moving to check his bandages out of habit, even though his wound had healed enough that daily checks were no longer strictly necessary. Is it true? Did they find something in his quarters? They found correspondence, Cale said quietly. Letters exchanged with someone outside the Citadel, written in code, but Alden's people are skilled enough to break it. It's not conclusive yet, but it's enough to hold him for questioning. Mira sat down slowly in the chair across from him, processing the news. If he was involved, why would he target you? What could he possibly gain from your death? I don't know yet, Cale admitted. Power, perhaps. Or someone else's power. Someone using him as a tool to reach closer to the throne than they could manage on their own. Until we know who he was corresponding with, we won't understand the full shape of what we're dealing with. She studied his face, noting the careful control he was exercising over his expression, the way exhaustion pulled at the corners of his eyes, despite his outward composure. You're worried, she said. Not just about the investigation, about something else. He hesitated, then met her gaze directly. If Garrett was involved, and if he was asking questions about you specifically, that means whoever he was working with may already see you as connected to me in a way that makes you a target too. I don't like that thought. I'm not afraid, she said, though the words came out steadier than she entirely felt. I know you're not, he said, a faint, tired smile touching his lips. That's part of what worries me. You walked toward danger the same way you walked into this room the first day we met, without a second thought for your own safety. Someone has to, she said simply, and he let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head, though the warmth in his expression as he looked at her told her the words had landed somewhere deeper than simple humor. Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door, and Commander Alden entered a moment later, his expression grim, a folded piece of parchment clutched in one hand. He glanced at Mira briefly, before turning his full attention to Cale. We've broken part of the code, he said. It's not complete, but enough to confirm our suspicions. Garrett Finch was in contact with someone claiming ties to House Ravensworth. Cale's expression darkened immediately, and Mira, unfamiliar with the name, looked between the two men, trying to understand the significance of what had just been said. House Ravensworth was stripped of its lands and titles nearly a decade ago, Cale explained, seeing her confusion. My father made that decision, believing the family had grown too ambitious, too willing to undermine the crown for their own gain. If someone from that house is behind this, it means the attack wasn't simply about removing me. It was about reclaiming power they believe was unjustly taken from them. That's a long time to wait for revenge, Mira said. Ambition has patience most people lack, Alden said grimly. And if they've been planning this for years, waiting for the right opportunity, then Garrett Finch may only be one piece of a much larger effort still moving within these walls. We cannot assume the danger has passed simply because we've found one conspirator. The weight of his words settled over the room, and Mira found herself thinking again of the strange, watchful eyes that had followed her through the corridors that morning, wondering now How many of them might belong to people connected to whatever remained of House Ravensworth's ambitions, still hidden among the Citadel's staff and guards? "What happens now?" she asked. "We continue investigating," Alden said, quietly, carefully, until we understand the full scope of who else may be involved. In the meantime, I want increased security around both of you. No unnecessary movement through the Citadel, and absolutely no unescorted trips beyond these walls until we have a clearer picture of the threat." Cale nodded in agreement, though Mira could see the frustration simmering beneath his composed exterior, the restlessness of a man used to commanding his own movements, now forced into careful, cautious restriction. Alden left shortly after, promising to return with further updates as soon as they emerged, and the room fell into a heavy silence once the door closed behind him. "I don't like this," Cale said finally, his voice low. "Being confined, waiting for someone else to uncover the danger, instead of facing it directly." "I understand that," Mira said. "But right now, patience might be the only thing keeping both of us alive. Whoever is behind this has been planning for years. We won't unravel it by rushing into the open before we understand what we're truly facing." He looked at her for a long moment, something in his expression softening despite the tension still gripping the room. "When did you become so wise about matters of court and conspiracy?" he asked, a faint teasing note returning to his voice despite everything. "I'm not wise about any of it," she said. "I just know that rushing into danger without understanding it first usually makes things worse, not better. I've seen it happen with wounds people refuse to treat carefully, and I imagine it works the same way with threats like this." He let out a quiet laugh, some of the tension easing from his shoulders despite everything still weighing on them both. "You have a talent for making even the most frightening situations feel manageable," he said. "I don't know about that," she said. "But I do know that whatever is coming, we're better off facing it with clear heads than with fear driving every decision." They sat together in comfortable silence after that, the earlier tension slowly giving way to something steadier, a shared understanding that had grown between them over the past several days, forged through the strange circumstances that had brought them together in the first place. Outside the window, the Citadel continued its normal rhythm, guards changing posts, healers moving between wings, servants carrying trays and linens through the winding corridors, all of it carrying on as though nothing had changed, even though everyone within those walls now understood that danger still moved among them, patient and unseen, waiting for its next opportunity to strike. That evening, as Mira made her way back toward her quarters under the watchful escort of an additional guard, now assigned to her safety, she found herself thinking about how quickly everything had changed since her first day in the Citadel. She had arrived expecting nothing more than the challenge of learning a new position, of proving her skills as a healer in an unfamiliar place. Instead, she had stumbled into the middle of a conspiracy, reaching back nearly a decade, tangled up with a king whose growing trust in her felt as significant and as dangerous as any wound she had ever treated. She thought of Garrett Finch, wondering what role he had truly played in the attack that had nearly cost Cale his life, wondering how many others within these walls might share his hidden loyalties. And she thought of Cale himself, of the quiet vulnerability she had glimpsed beneath his guarded exterior, the way his trust in her had grown steadily, despite every reason he might have had to remain cautious. Whatever came next, she understood now that there was no simple path back to the life she had imagined for herself when she first arrived at the Citadel gates. She had become part of something far larger than a single healing assignment, tangled up in danger and loyalty and a connection to the king that she was only beginning to understand the true weight of. And as she settled into her narrow bed that night, staring up at the shadowed ceiling above her, she found herself wondering, with a mixture of unease and something that felt almost like anticipation, exactly what the coming days would reveal about the conspiracy still moving quietly through the halls around her, and about the man whose life had become so unexpectedly tangled with her own. A full week passed before Commander Alden returned with news significant enough to summon both Mira and Cale together for a formal briefing, and in that time, the Citadel had settled into a strange, watchful calm, the kind that comes not from safety, but from exhaustion, from too many days spent waiting for a threat that refused to fully reveal itself. Mira had grown accustomed to her new escort, a quiet, capable guard named Colin Ashford, who walked a respectful distance behind her wherever she went, and she had grown even more accustomed to the daily rhythm of her visits with Cale, visits that had shifted, almost without her noticing, from purely medical checkups into something closer to companionship. His wounds had healed well enough now that her visits no longer required the careful, clinical attention they once had. The stitches along his side had been removed days earlier, leaving only a thin, healing scar behind, and the bruising along his ribs had faded entirely. And yet she found herself still making the walk to his chambers each morning, and he found himself still waiting for her arrival, with an eagerness that surprised him more than he cared to admit. "You don't need a healer anymore," she pointed out one morning, only half teasing, as she checked the faint scar along his side out of habit rather than necessity. "Perhaps not for my wounds," he said, watching her with an expression that made her pause. "But I've found I still look forward to your visits regardless." She felt heat rise in her cheeks and busied herself with packing away her supplies, unwilling to examine too closely the way his words settled warmly in her chest. Their conversations over the past week had grown easier, filled with stories from her training in the eastern provinces, tales of difficult patients and stubborn injuries, and in turn, quieter reflections from him about the weight of ruling a kingdom that had never quite recovered from the losses of the war that took his father from the throne years earlier. It was during one such conversation, as she sat across from him going over the small details of daily life that had become their comfortable routine, that Commander Alden arrived with news that shattered the fragile calm they had built between them. "We've identified the second conspirator," Alden said, closing the door firmly behind him, before continuing. "A member of the kitchen staff named Derek Vance. He was responsible for adjusting the guard schedules the night of the attack, working alongside Garrett Finch to ensure the corridor you walked through was left unprotected." Cale's expression hardened immediately. "Has he been questioned?" "He has," Alden said grimly, "and what he revealed is deeply concerning. The correspondence with House Ravensworth was not simply about removing you from the throne. It was about creating enough chaos within the Citadel to justify a change in leadership entirely, positioning someone loyal to their cause to step into a position of influence during the disorder that would follow your death." "Do we know who?" Mira asked, unable to stay silent despite the formal weight of the briefing. "Not yet," Alden admitted. "Vance claims he was never given a full picture of the plan, only instructions to carry out specific tasks. But he did reveal one detail that concerns me greatly. He said the conspiracy extends beyond the two men we've already identified, and that whoever remains involved has grown aware that their initial attempt failed, which means they are likely already planning another approach." The room fell into heavy silence at those words, and Mira felt a cold weight settle into her stomach as she processed what Alden had just revealed. Another attempt meant the danger surrounding Cale had not diminished at all over the past week, despite the careful, measured calm they had settled into. If anything, it meant the danger had only grown more urgent, more desperate, as whoever remained hidden within the conspiracy scrambled to salvage a plan that had already failed once. "What do we do?" she asked. "We increase security immediately," Alden said. "And we need to consider limiting your visits here as well, given how closely your presence has become tied to the king's daily routine. If the conspirators are watching, as we now suspect they are, your consistent presence makes you a predictable target, one they may attempt to use against him if they cannot reach him directly." Cale's expression shifted sharply at those words, something fierce and protective flashing behind his eyes. "Absolutely not," he said, his voice carrying a firmness that left no room for argument. "If they wish to use her against me, removing her from my side accomplishes nothing except leaving her unprotected and isolated, an easier target rather than a harder one. She stays close, under the same protection surrounding me, not scattered off on her own where they can reach her more easily." Alden studied him for a long moment, something calculating behind his tired eyes, and then he nodded slowly, accepting the decision, even though Mira could tell it was not the outcome he had hoped for. "Very well," he said, "but I want additional guards stationed throughout this wing, and I want both of you kept informed of every development in the investigation moving forward. We cannot afford further surprises." Once Alden left, the room settled into a heavy, uneasy quiet, and Mira found herself studying Cale's expression, the fierce protectiveness that had flared so suddenly at the suggestion she be moved away from him. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. Alden's suggestion made sense, from a purely strategic standpoint. "Perhaps," Cale said, But I've spent the past week watching you walk into danger without hesitation, treating me when everyone else was too afraid to try, standing beside me through threats you didn't fully understand when you first agreed to this arrangement. I'm not willing to simply set that aside, because it might be strategically convenient. You've become important to me, Mira. I won't pretend otherwise, not to Alden, and not to you. The admission hung in the air between them, honest and unguarded, in a way that neither of them had allowed their conversations to become before, and Mira felt her heart quicken at the weight of his words, the sincerity behind them, impossible to mistake for anything else. You've become important to me too, she admitted quietly, surprising herself with how easily the words came once she allowed herself to speak them. I didn't expect that. Walking into this citadel a week ago, I didn't expect any of this. Neither did I, he said, a faint, genuine smile touching his lips, despite the tension still gripping the rest of the room. For the first time in longer than I care to admit, something good has come from all of this chaos. They sat together in comfortable silence after that, the weight of the ongoing threat still pressing against them, but softened now by the honesty they had finally allowed themselves to share. Mira understood, sitting there across from him, that whatever danger still lingered within the citadel walls, whatever conspiracy remained hidden and waiting to strike again, she was no longer simply a healer, caught up in circumstances beyond her control. She had become something more to him, something that mattered deeply, and that realization carried its own kind of weight, its own kind of responsibility she had not fully anticipated when she first agreed to this arrangement. Later that evening, as she made her way back toward her quarters, with Colin walking his usual quiet distance behind her, she found Priya waiting near the entrance to the healing wing once again, her expression carrying a seriousness that told Mira more bad news was coming, before her friend even spoke a word. You should know people are talking, Priya said quietly, falling into step beside her. About you and the king, about how close you've become. Some of it is admiration, but not all of it. There are people within this citadel who see your closeness to him as dangerous, not because of the conspiracy, but because they don't believe an unbonded Omega healer should hold this much influence over the crown. I'm not trying to hold influence over anything, Mira said, frustration creeping into her voice despite her efforts to remain calm. I'm just doing my job, and trying to stay alive while I do it. I know that, Priya said gently, but perception matters just as much as truth, especially within these walls. Be careful who you trust, Mira. Not everyone who smiles at you in the corridor has your best interests at heart. The warning settled uneasily into her thoughts as she continued back toward her quarters that night, joining the growing list of dangers she now had to navigate carefully. Threats that extended far beyond the hidden conspirators still lurking somewhere within the citadel. Between the political suspicion surrounding her closeness to Kale and the very real danger of another attempt on his life, Mira understood now that the path ahead of her had grown far more complicated than the simple act of healing she had once imagined her role within these walls to be. But even with all of that weighing on her thoughts, she found herself returning again and again to the honesty Kale had shared with her that afternoon, to the fierce protectiveness in his eyes when he refused to let her be moved away from his side. Whatever complications and dangers lay ahead, she understood now that she was no longer facing them alone, and that realization, more than anything else, gave her the steady courage she would need for whatever came next. Commander Alden's additional guards arrived within the day, transforming the quiet East Wing into something resembling a fortress within a fortress. Where Mira had once walked the corridor to Kale's chambers, with only Colin trailing behind her, she now passed no fewer than 6 armed guards positioned at intervals along the route, each one watching the halls with sharp, careful eyes. The change unsettled her at first, a constant reminder of the danger still lurking somewhere unseen, but within a few days, she found herself growing used to their presence, the way their careful vigilance had become simply another part of the strange new rhythm her life had settled into. Kale, for his part, had grown restless with the confinement, his physical recovery complete enough now that the enforced caution chafed against him more with each passing day. Mira noticed it in the way he paced the length of his chambers when she arrived each morning, in the sharp edge that crept into his voice during meetings with his advisors, a man clearly unaccustomed to being kept from the business of ruling his kingdom by threats he could not yet see clearly enough to confront directly. You look like you're about to climb the walls, she observed one afternoon, finding him standing at the window again, staring out over the citadel grounds with an expression of barely contained frustration. I feel like I am, he admitted. I've spent my entire life learning to act, to lead, to face danger directly, rather than simply waiting for it to reveal itself. This waiting, this endless caution, it doesn't suit me. I understand that, she said, moving to stand beside him at the window. But rushing into danger before you understand its full shape rarely ends well. You've told me that yourself, more than once. He glanced at her, a faint, rueful smile touching his lips. It's frustrating when my own words get used against me. That's what happens when you say wise things, she said, a teasing note in her voice that drew a genuine laugh from him, the first real laugh she had heard from him in days. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door, and one of the newly assigned guards entered, his expression carefully neutral in the way soldiers trained to deliver difficult news often adopted. Commander Alden requests your presence, he said, addressing Cale directly. There has been a development. Cale exchanged a glance with Mira before nodding, and together they followed the guard through the heavily secured corridor toward the council chamber, where Alden waited with an expression grimmer than Mira had seen since the day they first learned of Garrett Finch's involvement in the conspiracy. We've located the third conspirator, Alden said without preamble, once the doors closed behind them. A council member named Adrian Cole. He has been quietly funneling information about the Citadel's security arrangements to House Ravensworth for nearly 3 years, long before the attack that nearly took your life. Mira felt a chill move through her at the revelation. 3 years, she repeated. That's a long time to plant someone that deep within the council. It is, Alden agreed. And it tells us this conspiracy runs far deeper and has been far more patient than we initially believed. Cole has been cooperative under questioning, hoping for leniency, and what he's revealed is deeply troubling. House Ravensworth has not given up on reclaiming their lost power. If anything, the failure of the first attempt has only made them more determined and more careful about how they proceed next. What does that mean for us? Cale asked, his voice tight with restrained tension. It means they will likely wait for an opportunity that feels safer than a direct attack, Alden said. Something that appears accidental, or something that exploits a moment when your guard is naturally lowered. Cole mentioned overhearing discussions about an upcoming diplomatic gathering, one where security is traditionally lighter to accommodate visiting dignitaries from allied territories. The Autumn Accord, Cale said grimly, understanding settling over his features. It's scheduled for next month. Representatives from every allied territory will be present, along with reduced security protocols meant to signal trust and openness between our nations. An event like that would provide exactly the kind of opportunity a patient conspiracy would wait for, Alden said. I recommend we consider postponing it, or at minimum, significantly increasing security despite the diplomatic complications that will cause. Cale was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing the political consequences of altering an event that had been planned for months, an event meant to strengthen fragile alliances that had taken years to rebuild after the war that claimed his father's life. Postponing it sends a message of weakness, he said finally. It tells our allies, and more importantly, it tells House Ravensworth, that their tactics are working, that fear is shaping the decisions of the crown. I won't give them that satisfaction. Then we increase security, without announcing it publicly, Alden said. Quiet measures, positioned carefully enough that our allies won't notice anything unusual, but thorough enough to prevent whatever opportunity House Ravensworth may be hoping to exploit. Cale nodded slowly, accepting the plan even as the tension in his shoulders remained visible. Mira watched the exchange with a growing sense of unease, understanding that whatever calm they had settled into over the past week was about to be tested in ways far more significant than the quiet, careful days that had passed since Garrett Finch's arrest. Once the meeting concluded and they made their way back toward his chambers, Cale's earlier restlessness had given way to something heavier, a quiet, focused determination that Mira recognized as the weight of leadership settling firmly back onto his shoulders. You're worried about the Accord, she said once they were alone again. I'm worried about everyone who will be present, he admitted. Dignitaries, their families, my own advisors. If House Ravensworth is willing to risk exposure by acting during such a public event, they must be growing desperate enough to accept significant collateral risk to achieve their goal. That kind of desperation makes people unpredictable, and unpredictable enemies are the most dangerous kind. Then we prepare carefully, she said, and we stay close enough to protect each other. The same way we have been since all of this began. He looked at her then, something warm and grateful passing behind his eyes despite the tension still gripping the rest of his expression. I don't know how I managed before you arrived, he said quietly, facing all of this alone. You managed the same way anyone manages difficult things, she said. One day at a time, doing the best you can with what you have. But I'm glad I don't have to imagine facing it alone anymore either. The weeks leading up to the autumn accord passed in a blur of careful preparation, quiet security measures woven invisibly into the fabric of the Citadel's daily routine, guards repositioned without announcement, additional healers brought in under the pretense of preparing for the medical needs of visiting dignitaries, though Mira understood their true purpose extended far beyond simple diplomatic courtesy. Throughout it all, her bond with Cale continued to deepen, forged through shared danger and honest conversation, through quiet moments of comfort found in each other's company, despite the growing weight of the threat still looming ahead of them. On the eve of the accord, as the Citadel prepared to welcome dozens of dignitaries from allied territories the following morning, Mira found herself once again standing beside Cale at the window of his chambers, watching the last light of day fade over the grounds below, where workers were putting the final touches on the elaborate preparations for tomorrow's gathering. Whatever happens tomorrow, he said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them, I want you close, not simply for your own safety, though that matters more to me than I can easily express, but because I don't think I could face whatever comes without knowing you're nearby. I'll be close, she said, reaching for his hand without fully considering the gesture until his fingers closed around hers, warm and steady. We're facing this together, the same way we've faced everything since that first morning. He turned to look at her fully then, something in his expression shifting into a quiet intensity that made her breath catch slightly. I meant what I said before, he told her, about how important you've become to me. Whatever tomorrow brings, I need you to know that clearly, without doubt. I know, she said softly. I feel the same way. They stood together at the window a moment longer, hands clasped, the weight of tomorrow's uncertain danger settling over them both, but softened now by the quiet strength they had found in each other over these past weeks. Whatever House Ravensworth had planned, whatever danger lingered just beyond the reach of their careful preparations, Mira understood that she would face it standing beside him, the same way she had faced everything since that first fateful morning when no one had thought to tell her which patient to avoid. The morning of the autumn accord arrived with a clear sky stretched wide over the Citadel, sunlight glinting off the polished stone courtyards where servants had spent the entire night arranging banners bearing the crests of every allied territory expected to attend. Mira woke before dawn, her stomach tight with a nervous energy she hadn't felt since her very first day walking through the Citadel gates, and by the time she made her way toward the grand hall where the gathering would take place, the entire complex had transformed into something she barely recognized, filled with unfamiliar faces, foreign dialects, and the careful, practiced smiles of diplomats who had traveled great distances to be present. She found her assigned position near the edge of the hall, close enough to reach Cale quickly should anything require her attention, but positioned discreetly enough not to draw unnecessary notice from the gathered dignitaries. Colin stood a short distance away, his posture relaxed but his eyes constantly moving across the crowd, and she spotted several other guards positioned strategically throughout the hall, their formal uniforms doing little to disguise the sharp, watchful attention they paid to every corner of the room. Cale entered shortly after, dressed in formal attire that made him look every inch the king she had first learned he was, though the warmth in his eyes when they briefly found hers across the crowded hall reminded her of the man she had come to know these past weeks, the one who laughed at her teasing and shared quiet vulnerabilities with her in the privacy of his chambers. He moved through the gathering with practiced ease, greeting each dignitary with careful diplomatic warmth, and Mira watched from her position near the edge of the hall, admiring the composed strength he carried, despite the danger she knew weighed on him beneath the surface. The morning passed without incident, filled with formal speeches and careful diplomatic exchanges, and Mira gradually allowed herself to relax, wondering if perhaps the extensive precautions Alden had arranged would prove unnecessary after all, if perhaps House Ravensworth had decided against acting during such a heavily observed event. But as the afternoon wore on, and the gathering moved toward the outdoor gardens for the traditional exchange of gifts between allied territories, she noticed Colin's posture shift subtly beside her, his attention sharpening on something near the garden's edge. "What is it?" she asked quietly, moving closer to him. "I'm not certain," he said, his eyes never leaving the point that had caught his attention. "But that man near the eastern hedge, the one wearing the deep blue coat, I don't recognize him from any of the visiting delegations, and he's been standing in the same spot for nearly 20 minutes, without approaching anyone." Mira followed his gaze and found the man he described, standing alone near the garden's edge, his posture too still, too deliberate for someone simply admiring the scenery. Something about his stillness sent a cold prickle of unease down her spine. "We should tell Alden," she said. Colin nodded and moved to signal one of the other guards, but before the message could be relayed, the man near the hedge shifted his weight and reached inside his coat, and Mira's healer's instincts, honed through years of recognizing danger before it fully revealed itself, screamed a warning, even before she consciously understood what she was seeing. "He has a weapon," she said sharply, already moving. The next several seconds unfolded in a chaotic blur. Colin lunged forward, shouting a warning that cut through the polite murmur of the gathered crowd, and guards positioned throughout the garden reacted instantly, several of them converging on the man in the blue coat, before he could complete whatever action he had intended. Screams erupted from the nearby dignitaries as they scattered away from the sudden commotion, and Mira's eyes found Cale immediately, relief flooding through her when she saw guards already forming a protective circle around him, moving him swiftly back toward the safety of the interior hall. But even as that relief settled over her, a second commotion broke out on the opposite side of the garden, and Mira's stomach dropped as she realized the first man had been a distraction, drawing attention and guards away from a second, more carefully positioned threat. She caught a glimpse of movement near the servants' entrance to the hall, a figure moving with the same deliberate stillness the first man had shown, and horror flooded through her as she understood, with sudden clarity, that this figure was positioned directly in the path guards were currently moving Cale through. "Cale!" she shouted, pushing through the scattering crowd with a desperation that overrode any thought for her own safety. The servants' entrance. Her warning reached the guards just in time, and they redirected their protective formation sharply, moving Cale away from the servants' entrance and back toward the main hall instead. The second figure, realizing their position had been discovered, turned and fled into the chaos of the scattering crowd, disappearing before any of the guards could reach them. The garden fell into a tense, uneasy quiet in the aftermath, dignitaries being escorted swiftly to secure locations within the citadel, guards fanning out to search for any additional threats that might still be lurking among the grounds. Mira found herself pulled aside by Colin, his expression tight with barely contained tension, as he confirmed she was unharmed, and it wasn't until nearly an hour later, once the immediate chaos had settled into careful, methodical security sweeps, that she was finally able to make her way to Cale's chambers, where Commander Alden had already gathered to assess the full scope of what had just occurred. Cale crossed the room the moment she entered, pulling her into a brief, fierce embrace that surprised her with its intensity, though she found herself relaxing into it without hesitation, grateful beyond words to find him safe and unharmed. "You saved my life," he said quietly, pulling back just enough to look at her, his hands still resting on her shoulders, as though he needed the physical reassurance that she was truly there, truly safe. "If you hadn't seen that second man, if you hadn't shouted when you did." "I just saw what needed to be seen," she said, her voice unsteady, with the adrenaline still coursing through her system. "Anyone would have done the same. Not anyone would have pushed through a panicking crowd to reach me," he said, a fierce gratitude in his eyes that made her breath catch. "Not anyone would have put themselves in danger the way you just did." Commander Alden cleared his throat gently, drawing their attention back to the more immediate business at hand. "We've captured the first assailant," he said. "He's being questioned now, though he claims to know very little about the larger plan, simply that he was paid to create a distraction. The second individual, the one Mira spotted near the servants' entrance, escaped in the chaos, but we found this near where he was standing." He held up a small, folded piece of parchment, and Cale took it carefully, unfolding it to reveal a short message written in a careful, deliberate hand. His expression darkened as he read it, and he passed it silently to Mira, who felt a cold weight settle in her chest as she read the words herself. "The crown will return to those who deserve it. This is not finished. House Ravensworth," Cale said grimly, handing the note back to Alden. "They're growing bolder, and more desperate. 2 attempts within the span of a month, and this second one nearly succeeded despite every precaution we took. They will keep trying, Alden said. As long as anyone connected to their cause believes there is still a path back to power, they will keep finding new ways to attempt it. We need to move beyond simply defending against their attacks, and begin actively working to dismantle whatever remains of their network within these walls and beyond them. Cale nodded, his jaw set with grim determination. Then that is exactly what we will do, he said. I want a full investigation launched, tracing every possible connection back to House Ravensworth, no matter how distant or how carefully hidden. I want to know exactly who remains loyal to their cause, and I want them found before they have another opportunity to act. Alden nodded and left to begin organizing the investigation, and once the door closed behind him, the room settled into a heavy quiet, broken only by the sound of their own breathing, still slightly unsteady from the chaos of the afternoon. Mira found herself sitting beside Cale, on the edge of the wide bed that had once served as his recovery space, her hands trembling slightly now that the immediate danger had passed, and the full weight of how close they had come to disaster was finally settling in. I keep thinking about how close it was, she admitted quietly. If I hadn't looked in that direction at that exact moment, if I hadn't recognized what I was seeing quickly enough. But you did, he said, reaching for her hand and holding it steady between his own. You saw it, and you acted, and because of that, we're both still here, still safe, still able to face whatever comes next together. That matters more than dwelling on what might have happened instead. She nodded, though the tremor in her hands didn't fully ease, and he pulled her closer, wrapping an arm around her shoulders in a gesture that felt entirely natural despite how new this level of physical closeness still was between them. They sat together in silence for a long while, drawing steady comfort from each other's presence, and gradually, the tension in her shoulders began to ease, replaced by a quiet, grounding warmth that came from simply being close to him, safe, together, having survived another attempt on both their lives. Whatever House Ravensworth planned next, whatever danger still lingered unseen within the Citadel's walls or beyond them, Mira understood now, sitting there beside him in the quiet aftermath of the day's chaos, that she was fully and completely entangled in this fight. No longer simply a healer who had wandered into danger by accident, but someone who had chosen, deliberately and without hesitation, to stand beside the king through whatever came next, danger and all. In the days that followed the attack at the Autumn Accord, the Citadel transformed once again, this time into something closer to a fortress under siege, though the danger remained carefully hidden from the visiting dignitaries who had been swiftly and quietly escorted back to their own territories following the incident. Commander Alden's investigation expanded rapidly, guards fanning out through every corner of the Citadel and the surrounding city, questioning anyone with even the faintest possible connection to House Ravensworth's remaining network. Mira found herself drawn more deeply into the investigation than she had expected, her position beside Cale granting her access to briefings and discussions that would have remained entirely closed to her only weeks earlier. She sat quietly through most of these sessions, listening as Alden's people pieced together fragments of information, names and locations, slowly forming a clearer picture of the conspiracy that had been quietly working against the crown for years. It was during one such briefing, nearly a week after the failed attack, that Alden brought news that changed the shape of everything they had been working toward. We've identified the individual who escaped the garden that day, he said, spreading a hand-drawn sketch across the table before them. A man named Marcus Doyle, formerly employed within the Citadel's own guard, dismissed nearly 2 years ago, under circumstances that were never fully explained at the time. We believe he has been the primary contact between House Ravensworth and their network within these walls ever since. Do we know where he is now? Cale asked, studying the sketch carefully. We believe he's hiding somewhere within the lower city, Alden said, close enough to maintain contact with whoever remains involved here, but far enough removed to avoid immediate detection. My people are working to narrow down his location, but the lower city is dense and difficult to search without drawing unwanted attention. Mira studied the sketch as well, something about the face nagging at the edges of her memory, though she couldn't immediately place why. Wait, she said slowly, leaning closer to examine the drawing more carefully. I think I've seen him before. Both men turned to look at her with sudden sharp attention. Where? Cale asked. She closed her eyes, trying to pull the memory into clearer focus. "In the dining hall," she said finally. "Weeks ago, before any of this happened. He was speaking with Garrett Finch, the healer who was arrested for his involvement in the first attack. I remember because it seemed like an odd pairing at the time. A guard speaking so closely with a healer who worked in an entirely different part of the Citadel. I didn't think anything of it then." Alden's expression sharpened with interest. "That confirms our suspicion that Doyle has been coordinating directly with the conspirators we've already identified," he said. "This is valuable information, Mira. It helps establish a clearer connection between the network operating within the Citadel and the individual currently coordinating with House Ravensworth from outside these walls." The briefing continued for another hour, details and connections slowly falling into place, and by the time it concluded, Mira found herself exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion, worn down instead by the sheer weight of the danger they continued to uncover, layer after layer of a conspiracy that had clearly been building for far longer than anyone had initially realized. As they walked back toward his chambers afterward, Cale reached for her hand without hesitation, a gesture that had become natural between them over the past weeks, and she found comfort in the simple warmth of his fingers wrapped around hers, a steady reminder that whatever danger surrounded them, they continued to face it together. "You've become an unexpected asset to this investigation," he said quietly as they walked. "I don't think Alden expected a healer to provide information as valuable as what you shared today. I just remembered something that seemed strange at the time," she said. "I'm glad it turned out to matter." "It matters a great deal," he said. "And it reminds me again how grateful I am that you walked into my chambers that first morning, despite every reason you might have had to turn and leave once you understood what you had stumbled into." "I never considered leaving," she said honestly. "Not then, and not now, even knowing everything I know about the danger still surrounding us." He stopped walking then, turning to face her fully in the quiet corridor, guards positioned a respectful distance away, giving them a rare moment of privacy despite the heightened security surrounding them at all times now. "That means more to me than I can easily express," he said, his voice low and sincere. "These past weeks, everything we've faced together, it's shown me something I didn't expect to find, especially not during a period defined by so much danger and uncertainty." "What's that?" she asked softly. "That I don't want to face any of this without you beside me," he said. "Not the investigation, not the danger, not anything that comes after we finally put an end to House Ravensworth's ambitions. I want you close, Mira, not simply because you're skilled at recognizing danger before it strikes, though that matters too, but because being near you has become something I genuinely need, something that steadies me in ways I didn't fully understand I was missing before you arrived." She felt her heart swell at his words, warmth spreading through her chest, despite the tension and danger that continued to surround them both. "I feel the same way," she said. "Whatever comes next, I want to face it standing beside you." He reached up to gently brush a strand of hair back from her face, his touch careful and tender in a way that contrasted sharply with the fierce protectiveness she had witnessed from him during moments of danger. "Then that is exactly what we will do," he said quietly. "Together, until whatever threat still lingers has been fully dealt with, and beyond that as well, if you'll have me." The quiet promise hung between them, warm and steady despite the danger still surrounding their lives, and Mira found herself smiling, a genuine, unguarded smile that felt entirely different from the careful, professional composure she had carried with her since her very first day in the Citadel. Whatever came next, whatever danger House Ravensworth continued to pose, she understood now that she was facing it not simply as a healer caught up in circumstances beyond her control, but as someone who had found, in the midst of chaos and uncertainty, a connection worth fighting for, worth protecting, worth standing beside, no matter what challenges still lay ahead. That evening, as reports continued arriving about Marcus Doyle's possible location within the lower city, Alden called another urgent briefing, his expression carrying a new intensity that told Mira and Cale something significant had shifted in the investigation. "We've located Doyle's hideout," Alden said without preamble once they gathered. "A small residence in the eastern quarter of the lower city. My people have it under careful surveillance now, but we believe he may attempt to move soon, likely to re-establish contact with whoever remains coordinating from House Ravensworth's side. If we move quickly and carefully, we may be able to capture him before he has the chance to disappear again, and with him, potentially unravel the remainder of this conspiracy entirely. Cale's expression hardened with focused determination. "Then we move tonight," he said, "before he has any chance to slip away again." "I would advise caution," Alden said carefully. "This needs to be handled by trained guards, not by the king himself. Your safety remains the priority here, and walking into a potentially dangerous situation directly would undo every precaution we've carefully built over these past weeks." Cale's jaw tightened, clearly torn between his instinct to face the danger directly and the practical wisdom of Alden's caution, and Mira found herself reaching for his hand again, a silent reminder of the promise they had just made to each other only hours earlier. "Let your guards handle this," she said quietly. "You've faced enough danger these past weeks. Let them do their work, and be ready to act once they bring back whatever information or confirmation this operation reveals." He looked at her for a long moment, something in her steady gaze helping to ease the fierce, protective tension gripping his shoulders, and finally, he nodded, accepting the wisdom in both her words and Alden's caution. "Very well," he said, "but I want to be informed the moment there is any development, regardless of the hour." Alden agreed, and left to begin organizing the operation, and as the night wore on, Mira and Cale waited together in his chambers, the tension of uncertainty stretching between them, even as they found comfort in each other's quiet presence. Whatever this night revealed, whatever came from the careful operation now unfolding somewhere within the lower city, Mira understood that they were drawing closer now to whatever final confrontation awaited them, closer to finally understanding the full shape of the danger that had first brought them together on that fateful morning weeks ago, and closer, too, to whatever future might finally be possible once that danger had been fully and completely dealt with. Midnight came and went without word from Alden's team, and the waiting stretched Mira's nerves thinner with every passing hour. Cale paced the length of his chambers in slow, deliberate circuits, his earlier calm giving way to restless tension that mirrored her own, and she found herself watching the door with increasing anxiety, willing it to open with news, any news, that would tell them how the operation in the lower city had unfolded. It was nearly 2 in the morning when the door finally burst open, but instead of Commander Alden, it was a guard she didn't recognize, his face pale and his breathing ragged from what had clearly been a hard run through the Citadel corridors. "Commander Alden requests your presence immediately," the guard said, addressing Cale directly, though his eyes flicked briefly to Mira as well. "Something has gone wrong." Cale was already moving before the guard finished speaking, and Mira followed close behind, her heart pounding with a dread that only deepened as they made their way through the Citadel toward the security wing, where Alden waited with an expression grimmer than anything she had seen from him before. "What happened?" Cale demanded the moment they entered. "The operation was compromised," Alden said, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "Doyle wasn't alone in that residence. There were at least 4 others present, and they were armed and prepared for exactly the kind of raid we attempted. 2 of my guards were injured in the confrontation, though they will recover. Doyle himself escaped through a hidden passage we didn't know existed." Mira felt her stomach drop at the news. "And the others?" she asked. "Were any of them captured?" "One," Alden said. "A woman, currently being held for questioning. She hasn't spoken yet, but we found something on her that concerns me greatly." He held up a folded piece of parchment, similar to the note they had found after the attack at the Autumn Accord, and Cale took it carefully, his expression darkening as he read the contents. He passed it wordlessly to Mira, and she felt a cold chill move through her as she read the words herself. "The healer knows too much. Deal with her before she becomes a permanent problem." The parchment trembled slightly in her hands, and Cale was at her side immediately, his hand steadying hers, his expression fierce with a protective anger she had never seen from him before. "They're targeting you directly now," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "Because of what you saw, because of what you remembered about Doyle and Garrett Finch together." "I'm not afraid," Mira said, though her voice carried a slight tremor that betrayed the fear she was working hard to suppress. "You should be," Alden said grimly. "This changes the calculation significantly. If they've decided you're enough of a threat to specifically target, then your safety requires far more than the precautions we've already put in place. I recommend moving you to a more secure location within the Citadel immediately, somewhere separate from the King's chambers, somewhere they would have far greater difficulty reaching." "No," Kale said immediately, the word sharp and absolute. I told you before, separating her from my protection makes her an easier target, not a harder one. She stays close to me, under the same security surrounding the crown itself. Alden hesitated, clearly weighing the competing risks, but before he could respond further, Mira spoke, her voice steadier now despite the fear still coursing through her. I want to help find them, she said. Not hide from this. I've already proven I notice things others might miss. If there's any way I can help identify the remaining conspirators, I want to be part of that effort, not simply protected from a distance while everyone else does the work. Kale turned to look at her, something between admiration and worry passing behind his eyes. Mira, he said carefully, this isn't a matter of proving yourself. Your safety matters more to me than any information you might be able to provide. I understand that, she said, meeting his gaze steadily. But hiding isn't going to make me safer, if they're determined enough to reach me regardless. I would rather face this directly, working alongside you and Alden, than spend every day waiting anxiously for a danger I can't see or influence. The room fell into a tense silence as Kale considered her words, clearly torn between his instinct to shield her from further danger and his growing respect for her determination to face threats directly, rather than retreat from them. Finally, he let out a slow breath and nodded, though the tension in his shoulders remained visible. Very well, he said, but you remain under heavy guard at all times, without exception, and you do not take unnecessary risks. Agreed? Agreed, she said, relief mixing with the steady resolve that had carried her through every dangerous moment since her arrival at the Citadel weeks earlier. Over the following days, the investigation intensified further, the captured woman eventually revealing fragments of information, under careful, patient questioning, details that slowly filled in the remaining gaps in Alden's understanding of the conspiracy's structure. Mira found herself reviewing sketches and descriptions alongside Alden's investigators, her sharp memory proving useful more than once, as she identified small details others had overlooked, faces she had glimpsed in passing, conversations that had seemed unremarkable at the time, but now carried new significance. It was during one such session, nearly a week after the failed raid, that a breakthrough finally emerged. The captured woman, worn down by days of careful questioning, finally revealed the location of a final meeting, planned between Marcus Doyle and the representative from House Ravensworth, who had been coordinating the entire conspiracy from the shadows. An old, abandoned warehouse near the docks on the outskirts of the lower city, scheduled to take place within 2 days. This is it, Alden said, gathering Kale and Mira along with his senior guards for a final planning session. If we move carefully, if we position ourselves correctly, we have a real opportunity to end this conspiracy entirely, capturing both Doyle and whoever has been directing House Ravensworth's efforts from behind the scenes. I want to be there, Kale said immediately. Alden's expression tightened with familiar reluctance. Your Majesty, he began. I've spent weeks watching others face this danger on my behalf. Kale interrupted, his voice firm and unwavering. I understand the risks, and I accept them, but I will not sit safely within these walls, while the final confrontation with the people who tried to kill me unfolds without my presence. This ends with me standing there, facing them directly, not hiding behind guards while others take the risks I should be sharing. Mira watched the exchange with a mixture of worry and understanding, recognizing in Kale's words the same stubborn determination that had driven her own insistence on remaining involved in the investigation rather than retreating into safety. She reached for his hand, and he glanced at her, something steadying passing between them in that brief, silent exchange. I'm coming too, she said quietly. Both Kale and Alden turned to look at her with matching expressions of concern, but she held her ground, her voice steady despite the fear still coiled tight in her chest. I've been part of this investigation from the very beginning, she said. I recognized Doyle when no one else did. I want to see this through to the end, standing beside both of you, not waiting anxiously somewhere else for news of what happened. Alden studied her for a long moment, clearly weighing the risks against the value of her sharp observational skills, and finally, he let out a slow, reluctant breath. If you come, he said, you remain under heavy guard at all times, positioned well behind the front lines of any confrontation. This is not negotiable. Understood, Mira said, and Kale squeezed her hand gently, a silent acknowledgement of the shared risk they were both choosing to accept, together, as they had faced everything else since that first fateful morning weeks earlier. The 2 days leading up to the operation passed in careful, methodical preparation, guards positioned strategically around the warehouse location. Contingency plans developed for every possible scenario Alden's experienced mind could anticipate. Mira spent the time reviewing every detail she could remember about the conspiracy, every face and conversation that might prove useful once they finally confronted the people responsible for the danger that had shadowed the Citadel for weeks. On the evening before the operation, as the Citadel settled into its familiar nighttime quiet, Cale found her in the small garden adjacent to his chambers, where she had gone to steady her nerves beneath the open sky, away from the tense preparations still unfolding throughout the rest of the fortress. "You're worried," he said, settling beside her on the stone bench where she sat. "About tomorrow," she admitted. "About everything that could go wrong. About losing you, after everything we've built together these past weeks." He reached for her hand, holding it steadily between his own. "I feel the same fear," he admitted, "about losing you. But I also feel something else, something steadier than the fear, and that's the certainty that whatever happens tomorrow, I want to face it standing beside you, the same way we've faced everything else since you walked into my chambers that first morning." She turned to look at him fully, moonlight catching the sincere warmth in his eyes, and felt her own fear settle into something steadier, something that matched the quiet resolve she saw reflected back at her. "Whatever tomorrow brings," she said softly, "we'll face it together." Together, he agreed, and beneath the quiet night sky, surrounded by the careful preparations for whatever confrontation awaited them, they found a moment of stillness, a shared strength that would carry them both through whatever the following day finally revealed about the conspiracy that had shadowed their lives since that very first, fateful morning, weeks ago. The warehouse district near the docks lay quiet under a heavy blanket of fog when Mira arrived alongside Cale and a carefully positioned unit of Commander Alden's most trusted guards, the damp night air carrying the distant sound of water lapping against the pier and the faint creak of old wooden structures settling in the cold. Alden had positioned his forces with meticulous care over the preceding 2 days, guards hidden in shadowed alcoves and rooftops surrounding the abandoned warehouse, where Doyle and his contact from House Ravensworth were expected to meet, and as the appointed hour approached, a tense, watchful silence settled over the entire operation. Mira stood positioned well behind the front line of guards, exactly as she had promised Alden, close enough to see the warehouse entrance through the thinning fog, but far enough removed to remain protected should the confrontation turn dangerous. Cale stood nearby, his posture rigid with focused attention, and though every instinct in her urged her to reach for his hand, to draw whatever comfort she could from his steady presence, she understood the need for careful silence, for discipline that could not afford to be compromised by even the smallest sound. "Movement," one of the guards whispered, and Mira's eyes snapped toward the warehouse entrance, where 2 figures had emerged from the fog, moving with the same deliberate caution the conspirators had shown throughout every stage of their carefully hidden operation. She recognized Doyle immediately from the sketch Alden had shared during their earlier briefings, his features sharp and watchful even at this distance, and beside him walked a second figure, taller, cloaked heavily against the cold, their face obscured beneath a deep hood that made identification impossible from where she stood. The 2 figures disappeared into the warehouse, and for several long, agonizing minutes, nothing happened. Mira's heart pounded against her ribs as she waited, watching Alden's silent signals pass between his positioned guards, coordinating the moment they would finally move to close the trap that had taken weeks of careful planning to construct. Then, without warning, the warehouse door burst open again, and chaos erupted. Doyle emerged first, moving swiftly toward a side alley that Alden's guards had already anticipated and blocked, and within seconds, he was surrounded, his attempt at escape cut off entirely before it could fully begin. But the second figure moved differently, faster, more calculated, breaking toward the pier instead, where a small boat waited, clearly prepared in advance, as an escape route Alden's careful planning had not fully accounted for. Guards moved to intercept, but the hooded figure was quick, cutting through the fog with practiced ease, and Mira watched with rising horror as the gap between the pursuing guards and the fleeing conspirator began to widen. And then, before she could fully process what was happening. Cale was moving too, breaking from his position and sprinting toward the pier, with a speed that startled everyone around him, guards shouting warnings that he ignored entirely. "Cale, no," Mira shouted, but her voice was lost in the chaos, and she found herself running after him despite every promise she had made, to remain safely behind the front line, unable to stop herself from following the fear that had seized her heart the moment she saw him rushing toward danger without hesitation. By the time she reached the pier, Cale had already closed the distance, tackling the fleeing figure just before they could reach the waiting boat, both of them crashing hard onto the weathered wooden planks. The hood fell back in the struggle, and Mira's breath caught sharply as she finally saw the face of the person who had orchestrated so much danger and fear over the past weeks. A woman with sharp, calculating features and cold eyes that carried none of the desperation Mira might have expected from someone whose entire plan had just collapsed around her. "Elena Cross," Cale said, his voice tight with recognition and fury, as he held her pinned firmly against the pier, guards arriving swiftly to secure her properly. "I should have known." The woman said nothing, her expression carrying a bitter, defiant calm, even as guards pulled her to her feet and bound her hands securely. Cale rose slowly, breathing hard from the struggle, and his eyes found Mira immediately, relief and lingering adrenaline warring across his features as he closed the remaining distance between them. "You were supposed to stay back," he said, though there was no real anger in his voice, only the shaky remnant of fear for her safety. "You were supposed to stay back too," she countered, her own voice trembling slightly as the fear that had driven her forward finally began to ease, now that she could see he was unharmed. He let out a short, breathless laugh, pulling her into a tight embrace that she returned without hesitation, both of them holding on a moment longer than strictly necessary, grateful simply to be standing there together, safe, in the aftermath of whatever danger had just concluded. Nearby, Doyle had been fully secured as well, and Commander Alden approached, his expression carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent weeks working toward exactly this outcome. "Elena Cross," he said, studying the bound woman with grim satisfaction, "former advisor to House Ravensworth before their fall from power. We suspected someone within their old circle remained active, but I confess I did not expect it to be her specifically." "She'll answer for everything," Cale said, his voice hardening as he looked at the woman who had orchestrated so much danger against him and everyone connected to the crown. Every attempt, every conspirator recruited into her cause, all of it. Elena Cross said nothing, her expression remaining coldly composed, even as the guards led her away toward whatever justice awaited her, and Mira felt the last of the tension that had gripped her for weeks finally begin to ease, replaced by a quiet, overwhelming relief that the danger which had shadowed their lives since that very first morning had, at last, come to an end. The days that followed the confrontation at the docks brought a flurry of activity throughout the Citadel, careful investigations confirming the full extent of Elena Cross's network, additional arrests following swiftly as the remaining pieces of the conspiracy were finally, fully dismantled. Mira found herself called before the Healers' Council once more, though this time the atmosphere carried none of the suspicion and fear that had marked her first appearance weeks earlier. "You have proven yourself an invaluable asset to the crown," the silver-haired councilwoman said, her earlier stern skepticism replaced now by genuine respect. "Your quick thinking during the Autumn Accord, your sharp memory that helped identify key conspirators, your willingness to stand beside the king through significant danger, all of it speaks to a character this citadel would be fortunate to formally recognize." The council had gathered specifically to discuss the old rule that had caused so much initial turmoil, the protocol forbidding unbonded Omega healers from treating the king without careful chaperone, and after lengthy deliberation, they announced their decision to formally reconsider the tradition, acknowledging that rigid adherence to old protocols had nearly cost the Citadel a healer, whose skill and courage had proven essential during the most dangerous weeks the kingdom had faced in years. Mira listened to their deliberations with a quiet sense of vindication, understanding that whatever chaos her arrival had caused weeks earlier, it had ultimately led to something meaningful, a reconsideration of tradition that would hopefully make things easier for whoever came after her. Healers, who deserved the chance to simply do their work without unnecessary suspicion, clouding every interaction. That evening, as the Citadel settled into a calm it had not known in weeks, Mira found Kale waiting for her in the same garden where they had shared their quiet conversation the night before the confrontation at the docks, moonlight casting soft shadows across the stone path between them. "It's over," she said, settling beside him on the familiar bench. "This particular danger is over," he agreed, reaching for her hand. "But I find myself hoping that what's between us is only just beginning." She turned to look at him fully, her heart warming at the sincerity in his eyes. "What are you saying?" she asked softly, though she already suspected the answer. "I'm saying that these past weeks, facing danger and uncertainty together, have shown me something I never expected to find," he said. "A partnership built on trust and honesty, on facing difficulty together, rather than hiding behind titles or protocols. I don't want that to end simply because the immediate danger has passed. I want to build something lasting with you, Mira, openly, without secrecy or hesitation, in whatever way you're willing to accept." Tears gathered unexpectedly in her eyes, warm and grateful, and she found herself smiling despite the emotion tightening her throat. "I want that too," she said, "more than I think I fully understood until just now, hearing you say it." He reached up to gently brush away the single tear that slipped free, his touch tender and sure. And then he leaned forward, closing the distance between them slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she chose. She didn't. The kiss that followed was soft and unhurried, carrying within it every quiet moment of trust and connection they had built together since that very first chaotic morning weeks earlier, when a healer who knew nothing about protocol or danger had simply walked into a room and done what she was trained to do. When they finally parted, resting their foreheads together beneath the quiet night sky, Mira felt a deep, settled peace that had nothing to do with the danger finally behind them, and everything to do with the man beside her, the connection they had built through weeks of shared trials, the future now stretching open and hopeful before them both. "No one told me which patient to avoid that first morning," she said softly, a faint, warm laugh coloring her voice. "I'm endlessly grateful for that," he replied, pulling her closer against him, and beneath the quiet stars stretching over the Blackthorn Citadel, two people who had found each other through danger and chaos settled into a future they had chosen deliberately, together, no longer bound by old rules or careful caution, but simply by the steady, unshakable connection that had grown between them since the moment she first walked through his door.